Good evening. It is good to be back with you. Always so good to be with the family. We continue this evening our preaching series through the book of Genesis. As we've discussed, this is a preaching series by means of character study. Genesis is comprised of 5 main character studies, that of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, and Joseph. We talked the first session with regards to the composition of Genesis, that the book of Genesis comprises roughly 2,700 years of time. The creation, roughly 4,500 BC, to the death of Joseph in Egypt, about 1800 BC. We talked about the fact that chapters 1 through 11, basically from the Garden of Eden to Abram, comprises 2,500 years of that 2,700 years. So most of that time is in the first 11 chapters. The rest of the book, chapters 12 through 50, the character studies, Abraham through Joseph, comprise roughly 200 years of their lives. So we are finally to the point where we're talking about Abram. Brethren, there's something we need to keep in mind when we're studying the word that God has given to us. Not only the what He has given to us, but the how. Because when you consider the book of Genesis, as we've said, chapters 1 through 11, 2,500 of 2,700 years, and yet when we hit Abram, suddenly time slows down. And the rest of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50, is about 200 years. That's significant. We need to be aware of that. What is God trying to teach us in the way that He's teaching us? We talked about the fact that the Bible is the story of Jesus, which means it's the story of the promise. The promise was given in the garden to Eve that through the seed of woman would come the one. And then Abram came along, and it was focused through him. No longer just the seed of woman, but the seed of Abraham. That's why time slows down, because between the garden and Abram, the promise just continued. Now, there were things that happened, and we talked about those in our first 3 sessions. We talked about creation. We talked about the sin explosion. We talked about the flood, the Tower of Babel, and we talked about the promise, how it was moving forward. Well, tonight we begin with our character studies. We've finally gotten to Abram, and we're going to spend all of our time talking about Abram. Abram, the story of his faith, comprises chapters, I'll say 12, but it actually starts in chapter 11, verse 27, all the way through chapter 25. 2,500 years, 11 chapters, right? The life of Abraham, more than 14 chapters. Again, what is God teaching us? This is what's important. Watching faith work through people's lives. Watching this promise get focused in this man. So, tonight, let's talk about Abraham. And we're going to address, as we are this study of Genesis, if you want to go ahead and turn to chapter 11, chapter 12. We are preaching through the book of Genesis as God has given us. So tonight, we're going to go through chapters 12 through chapters 25 in the order that they come. So, we're going to be talking about Abram receiving the first covenant. Then the covenant being confirmed, and a second covenant. Then that covenant sealed, and then the epilogue of Abram's life. So, the first covenant, Genesis chapter 11, verse 27, through chapter 14. Chapter 11, 27 gives us the genealogy of Terah, the father of Abram. Okay? They lived in Ur of the Chaldees, over and around modern-day Babylon, but I don't think that works. Where Babylon was, modern-day southern Iraq, I guess. And God called him and all of his family out to come to a place He would say. To Canaan was the destination, roughly 1,000 miles of travel. Because remember, there's that big desert. Here's where I do that fake map that no one can see. He's here, and Canaan is here, but there's a big desert in the middle. So they had to travel up Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, and then come south down into Canaan. Well, the whole family went up Mesopotamia to Haran, but then they stopped there. It seemed like Terah didn't want to go any further. And it wasn't until Terah died that Abram, his wife Sarai, and his nephew Lot, the son of Abraham's brother Haran, came down into Canaan. Through chapter 12 and verse 9, we have the calling detailed. God called Abram to come out. We see it in chapter 11, and then we have it retold to us and explained in chapter 12. It was going to be through him, through Abram, that all the nations of the world would be blessed. And associated with that blessing was a land promise and a people promise. Keep those in your mind, specifically the people promise. He came. Archaeologists have told us that they have discovered evidences that the ancient city of Ur had running water in it, brethren. And yet Abram and his family left that to travel in tents the rest of their days. And the only land that Abram and Sarai ever owned, and Sarai never owned it, I guess, was where they were buried. Then we get to chapter 12 and verse 10, and we have Abraham. I keep going back and forth. He's not Abraham till chapter 17. So Abram, his first stumble, and this was in Egypt. In chapter 12 and verse 10, we read that there was a famine in Canaan. And so there was food in Egypt, so Abram and his family went down into Egypt. Is that reminding you of anything? There are a lot of instances in the life of Abram that we see reflected in the lives of his children. I guess we shouldn't be surprised by that. As God's people encounter similar situations, they have similar results. So what happened? Well, Abram went down into Egypt. And here's what the problem was. Apparently, Sarai was beautiful. I don't mean pretty. I mean beautiful. To the point that Abram said, if the Egyptians see you, dear, you want to make your wife happy, husbands? This would be a nice thing to say. If the Egyptians see you, you are so beautiful that they're going to kill me so that they can get you. And so he asked Sarai to lie, to say that she was actually his sister, not his wife. Side note, it was partially true. They were half-brother and half-sister, had the same father, different mothers. But they're in Egypt. This is the situation. Pharaoh, again, sees Sarai, and she is all that. And he takes her, and he blesses Abram with stuff. And then he's warned by God. It doesn't tell us how. All we know is that there's a plague, and suddenly Pharaoh seems to know where that plague came from. We don't hear like we hear later that God actually told him that there was this issue. But Pharaoh comes to Abram and says, what did you do? Why did you lie to me? You could have caused me to sin. Here's your wife, and then he politely escorts them out of his kingdom. Okay? So far, we've got his calling, his blessing, and a stumble in Egypt. And then chapters 13 and 14 are basically stories of his nephew Lot and Abram in Canaan. In chapter 13, they return to Canaan from Egypt, and the issue is they have been blessed by Pharaoh and by God, so that they are such a large community with herds and all this that it's going to start causing problems between them. So Abram tells his nephew, we need to separate, just so that we don't start causing problems between us. You choose. If you go east, I'll go west. If you go west, I'll go east, and we'll separate. And Lot looked to the Jordan Valley towards Sodom, saw how beautiful and well-watered it was, and he chose to go east, and Abram went west. The next chapter, we have that problem of the 5 kings fighting against the 4 kings. And the 4 kings won. They were from northern Canaan up in Mesopotamia area. And they conquered the King of Sodom and all those areas. And they took prisoner Lot and all of his family. And so they go up. Abram hears about this to the west where he is. And he gathers to himself 318 trained men. And they go attack the armies of the 4 kings. And they overcome. They get all the goods, they bring back Lot and all his family and all his stuff, and they have that wonderful celebration. And there's an interesting theological issue there. The king of Sodom wants to reward Abram for what he did. But Abram says, in a somewhat nice way, I'll take nothing from you. Thank you. And then here comes Melchizedek, the king of righteousness, the king of peace from Salem. And he comes and he blesses Abram, and Abram not only accepts that blessing, but pays tithes to Melchizedek, the priest of the Most High God. That's the first covenant. That gets us through chapter 14. Then we have confirmation of that. There's a lot of confirmation. Understand, as a preacher, I feel compelled to come up with C words in this lesson and to try to differentiate this from other sections. So just say, wow, that was good, okay? That make me feel good. So there's a confirmation of that covenant and then a second covenant, which is really just a confirmation of the first. And that's chapters 15 through 17. In chapter 15, God basically speaks to Abram and says, hey, how you doing? You're doing great. Everything's going to be wonderful. Through you, your descendants, they're going to be like the dust in the earth. And Abram looks around and sees that he's got no children, and he's getting up there in years, and he says, I believe you. We have that famous verse, right, in verse 6, and it was accounted to him for righteousness for believing God. But what else did he say? Abram had said, is there anything you can give me so that I can know for sure? He basically just wants can you say absolutely or give me something? Do you remember what God did? God said, Abram, take some animals and cut them in half before us. He took a heifer, a ram, and a goat and split them in two. Now, that may sound very strange to us, but back in the day, covenants were established through this. The Hebrew word covet, berit, actually means to cut. And what they would do, the philosophy behind it is if, say, Dennis and I were going to make a covenant together, we'd take an animal, we'd cut the animal in two, we'd put the two parts apart from each other, we'd hold hands, and we'd walk between the two pieces. And what's symbolized there is, if either of us violate this covenant, may we be like this animal. Okay? Very harsh and brutal, but effective. So God tells Abram, do this. And he does it, and then a sleep falls upon Abram. And you remember he had that vision of that boiling pot or thing of embers passing through the animals. What's significant of that is Abram didn't have to pass through. God passed through. So this was a covenant God was going to ensure was fulfilled. And then at the end of the chapter, he gives that promise. All these lands are yours. Not right now. The fourth generation, all these will be yours because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Well, that's a high moment. Wonderful. What follows? Chapter 16. Another stumble for Abraham, this time with Hagar. God has said, for sure it's through you and Sarai that I will bring forth this people. Sarai says, I'm not getting any younger. Let's help God out a little bit. Here's my maid from Egypt. Go into her, produce a child. That will be the child that goes forward. Because in those days, that is the way you could do that. If you had a child with one of your slaves, the child would be considered yours and your heir. So they did that, and nothing but problems resulted. Go figure, right? Every time we try to help God out in that way, problems are caused. The first problem is, as soon as Hagar becomes pregnant, she begins to despise Sarai. Sarai doesn't like that and says, I want her gone, out of here right now. But there's a child there. The child comes back, and the child is born. That child is Ishmael, but it is not the child. In chapter 17, I hinted to you this morning. Go ahead and turn to chapter 17, please. After that has happened, chapter 17 and verse 1, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am Almighty God. Walk before me and be blameless. And I will make my covenant between me and you and will multiply you exceedingly. And Abraham fell on his face. And here he changes Abram's name from father to father of multitudes. Here he changes Sarai's name from Sarah to Sarah, or from Sarai to Sarah. And here again he says, it is not through Ishmael. It is going to be through your child, through Sarah, that the blessing will come. And then is instituted circumcision as a covenant. As I said this morning, I think if you look at 16 in the context of 16, you'll see something interesting about 17 and this circumcision that's instituted. A sign of the covenant from God. Even after all of this, brethren, look what Abraham said in chapter 17, 18, and 19. God has assured him, no, it's going to be through you and Sarah. That's who the child's going to be. You have a child now with Hagar, it's Ishmael. No, I will bless him, but he's not the one. It's going to be through Sarah. What does Abraham say after that? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. He's still trying. Can't we do it this way? A bird in the hand, right? Then God said, no, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. Laughter. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. So there's the confirmation and the second covenant. And that brings us to chapter 18. Chapters 18 through 22, we have this covenant sealed. How? Well, in chapter 18, we have another statement where God just says, Abraham now, it's coming. It's going to be through you. Appeared before him. Through you is going to come that child. And he's visited by the three visitors. Abraham seems to know that they are not just average men, but actually angels, and there's that angel of the Lord, sometimes called the Lord as a representative. And Abraham takes care of them, gives them the hospitality that is expected, and they mention that this child is coming. And what does Abraham do? Yeah, okay. Sarah's on the other side of the tent flap when they say, no, I'm telling you, next time we come, that child's going to be here. And what does Sarah do? Oh, man. That's why the name Isaac, laughter. But the promise is made again. Next year, at this time, she will have a child, a son. And then from verse 16 of chapter 18 all the way through chapter 19, we have this interesting story about God's judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah and the situation of Lot and his family. But I'd like to direct your attention that this shows God's faith in Abraham. We've seen Abraham's faith, usually pretty good, stumbles a couple times. But as God is getting ready to walk away, these three individuals are heading to Sodom and Gomorrah to see if the wickedness they heard of there was actually as wicked, because they're going to bring judgment. And God says, shall I do this thing and not tell Abraham? God's going to work his justice in the world, and yet here he stops and considers, should I tell Abraham about this? Because he's going to raise his children and teach them. And that great nation, he has great trust for Abraham and great love. And he tells him, this is what I'm going to do, Abraham. And Abraham is aghast. Sodom is a huge city, and Gomorrah is a huge city. And you remember the little debate he got in with God, right? Well, God, if you found 50 righteous men in Sodom, surely you wouldn't destroy it. And God said, don't call me surely, and no, I won't destroy it. So then Abram's trying to play with him again. Well, what if 5 of those 50 fell short? And it's funny because you can almost see God saying, I understand math, Abraham. If there are 45, I won't destroy the city. 30? If there are 30, I won't destroy the city. 20? If there are 20, I will not destroy the city. if there are 10, I will not destroy the city. Unfortunately, we know, how many did he find? And he just had him, Lot, get out of the city. It's an interesting thing that we see this, that Lot is spared because of his connection with Abraham, I'm sure, and because of his righteousness. In 2 Peter, we read about how Lot's righteous soul was tormented living in Sodom, which sometimes raises the question, why is he living there? Why wouldn't he move? But all we know is what we're told. That brings us to chapter 20. So Abraham has grown in his relationship with God. God's even taking him into his confidences with regards to justice. And then what happens in chapter 20? Another stumble. They're in Gerar, which is a Philistine city, ruled by a king named Abimelech. And guess what the situation is? Abraham, as they're going into Gerar, says, honey, the years have been kind to you, and you're still just as beautiful as you were when we went down into Egypt. Do me a favor. When we go into Gerar, please tell them you're my sister so that they don't kill me for you. And the same thing happens. In this, we hear that God actually approached Abimelech and said, because he had brought her into his house and it looked like he was beginning to take her as his wife, and God gave him a dream and said, don't do this. I will destroy you and all your people if you do this. And Abimelech is saying, wait a minute. I'm innocent in this. I don't know anything about it. And God basically says, I know, that's why you're still breathing. Because you're innocent. So Abimelech goes to Abraham and he says, what did you do? Do you understand what could have happened? Why did you allow this to happen? So what's this stumble again? It's a same stumble. And interesting, a little preview for it, his son Isaac is going to do the same thing in the same city. So there's another stumble. And then the wonderful news of chapter 21, verse 1. And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said. And the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. So there is the fulfillment of that promise. There is the continuation of the promise. Next section, the covenant sealed, chapters 18 through 22. I feel like I misspoke a while ago when I said the last section. If I did, I apologize. Chapters 18 through 22, the covenant is sealed. Turn to chapter 21 and verse 22, please. Abraham's light. We talked about this morning that Israel was to be a light unto the world, and that the whole world was to see that God was, and that he was active in the world through the blessings of Israel, their laws, their righteousness, and that they never lived up to that. Abram had plenty of stumbles, yet look at chapter 21, verse 22. And it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, spoke to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do. Now, therefore, swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me, with my offspring, or with my posterity, but that according to the kindness that I have done to you, you will do to me and to the land in which you have dwelt. Very similar to what we're going to see with Jacob and his father-in-law, Laban. Laban said, I've been blessed because you're blessed by God. My being close to you means I'm getting blessings. Abimelech here says, you are blessed of God. You are one of his. Please be kind to us who are near you. The light of Abraham, the light that Israel was supposed to shine, is seen in Abraham's life. And then chapter 22, we have that test. He has the child of promise. And God comes to him and says, take your son. Well, let's read the verses. Look at verse 2. Then he said, take now your son, underline it, brethren, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. the great test. And the great thing that we learn, especially from the Hebrews author, is Abraham's faith that was so weak because of the beauty of his wife, which was so weak that he would listen to his wife and go into Hagar and cause all that trouble. And then again would stumble with his wife. Now, he is so confident of God fulfilling the promises that in his mind, he is happy to go and take his son and offer him. Because he's confident, as the Hebrews author says, that even if I do kill him, God will raise him from the dead. Look at verse 5. So Abram's up, and he's taking his son to sacrifice him on the mountain. This is what he says to the young men that are going to wait at the bottom of the mountain. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." We will come back to you. What's he going to do? Kill his son. What does he know? We will come back to you. His faith has grown. Then look at verse 12 and verse 16. He was going to strike his son. The angel of the Lord stopped him. Verse 12, and he said, "Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son," underline it, "your only son from me." Verse 16, and he said, "By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son," underline it, "your only son. Blessing I will bless you, multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven and the sand which is at the seashore." Is Isaac his only son? No, he has another son named Ishmael. But you understand that this is that shadow of God who loves us so much that he gave his only begotten son that we might have the forgiveness of our sins. That's through chapter 22. Now the epilogue of Abraham's life, chapters 23, 24, and 25. In chapter 23, Sarah dies. And Abram goes and seeks to purchase some property to bury his wife. And that property be where he is buried, where Jacob is buried, and where Joseph says, "When I die and you go back home, take me there too, to be buried." Because of who I am, I like to joke. Remember where they were buried was that Scottish cave, the cave of Machpelah. Right? Did you get that, Machpelah? Probably not Scottish. But there she died, and there she was buried, the only land they ever owned. Chapter 24, a proper bride is sought for Isaac. Very similar to what Isaac does for Jacob. Abraham is living surrounded by Canaanites and their atrocious worship habits, right? The iniquity isn't full, but it is there. And so, in order to find a bride for his son, he goes back to the land of Haran, where the rest of his family stopped. Remember, Terah stayed up there, didn't come down. So he goes back there with his brother Nahor, and he finds a descendant for his son, and that's who Isaac marries, Rebekah. And then finally, chapter 25. Abraham remarries Keturah. He has 6 sons with her, and then he dies. One thing I'd like to put on your radar, look at chapter 25, verse 5 and 6. And Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but Abraham gave gifts to the sons of the concubines which Abraham had. And he sent them eastward, away from Isaac his son, to the country of the east. 2 things to note there. One, probably learned his lesson with the interaction with Ishmael and Isaac that didn't go so well earlier. He's going to separate them. He sent them away to the east. I would just put this on your radar. When Jesus comes, Magi come from what direction? The east. And who are they seeking? The King of the Jews. What would Babylonians have to do with the King of the Jews? Could it have been descendants of these who certainly had to know about Jehovah God? Who certainly had to know something of the promise? What that exactly was? I don't know. Just think on that. It's interesting. And Abraham died. Therefore, brethren, so many lessons we can take from the friend of God. Was the father of faith perfect? No. He had several stumbles. But he was faithful, brethren. When God said, I love this. My English teacher would hate it. God told Abraham to go, and Abraham went. And for the rest of his life, he just kept wenting wherever God told him to go. Had him to go to Canaan, had him to go to Egypt, had him to go back to Canaan. Abraham was faithful. So much we can learn. And note that this man, this Abraham, he wasn't the richest of men. His riches came mostly from the blessings of God. He wasn't the most powerful of men. He had no great armies. Took on armies with 318 men. That's impressive. But what was special about this man? Well, he was faithful, and he desired a heavenly country. So he didn't care about the modern conveniences of Ur. He didn't care about the family comforts of Haran. He didn't care about living all of his days in a tent as a stranger in a strange land. He sought a heavenly country. And that, brethren, we can say amen to. What about us today? Well, have we been called out? Just like Abraham was called out of Ur, we've been called out of this world. We've been called to be citizens of the kingdom, to have our citizenship actually in heaven, to live lives as strangers in a strange land. Not called to perfection, try for perfection, but called to faithfulness. And all of that because the one lesson you can't miss with Abraham is this: God is always faithful. God told Abraham, your children will be as the stars. Your children will be as the sand at the seashore. Your children will be as the dust of the ground. Abraham had no children until he was 100 years old, and then he just had one. How many descendants from them? Nations and nations and nations. God is faithful, and as we read with Sarah, fulfills all that he says. Do you know what God has promised us? Forgiveness of sin, everlasting life with him in heaven. He is faithful, and he will do that. If you've not taken him up on his offer to have your sins forgiven, to begin that new walk as a citizen of the kingdom, as a child of God, why not this evening? Why not come forward and begin? Put on Christ in baptism. Begin that new life unto everlasting life. Christians, Abraham kept wenting over and over and over. Don't get too comfortable. We are pilgrims here. We're just a passing through. Keep your mind focused on the goal, which is that heavenly country. Never lose sight, and we'll be there one day. If there's anything we can do to help you with this, we'd ask that you come as together we stand.